I'm gonna start off with a story. When I was in college, I worked this awesome gig as a valet attendant at this hotel in Pasadena, California. It was super sweet. Most nights were pretty average, pretty ordinary, pretty normal, except this one night. It was a special night, and it was all because this guy showed up. That's Paul Walker. No, it's not me. Don't be confused. It's Paul Walker, and if you don't know who he is, he was one of the famous actors in the movie series Fast and the Furious. It's okay if you didn't know that, but he gets out of the car, and I'm super excited. I'm like, okay, what are my lines? Welcome to the hotel. And then I continue, like this, right this way, Mr. Walker, see you later. But I'm like, no, I gotta say something to this guy. So I run after him, tap him on the shoulder, and I hit him with a, hey, dude, what's it like working with great white sharks? I know, you're silent. You're like, what was that? Weird question, right? I could have asked him anything. I could have asked about his family. I could have asked him what it was like being famous. I could have asked him just what's it like, being Paul Walker. Instead, I asked about sharks. The awesome thing is I met Paul Walker, which is pretty cool, but I didn't actually learn anything about him. I thought about that as I read through Exodus 17, because this is where we're introduced to Joshua for the first time. But like Paul Walker, we don't learn much about him. Really, we don't learn anything. We're not told his age. We're not told where he came from. We're not told about his background, which feels a little strange because Joshua will be one of the most important leaders in Israel's history. But Exodus is not interested in telling Joshua's story yet. Instead, what it shows us is what God is teaching his people. Listen to this from Exodus chapter 17, verse 7 through 13. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarreling of the people of Israel and because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. Verse 10, so Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. Verse 12, but Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hand, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. Our final verse, and Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. Long passage, I know. But when we hear all of that, it's easy for us to get lost in this chapter and think that it's only about a battle and a man standing on a hill with a staff in his hand. But this passage tells us so much more than that. And it's about so much more than that. It draws our attention to an important question the Israelites are asking. And that question is this: can we trust God to show up for us? Maybe you've been asking a similar question recently. Maybe it's because of a medical diagnosis, a strained relationship, or a financial setback. Whatever it is, those moments have a way of revealing where our trust has been placed. When the things we normally lean on begin to shake, what we are truly depending on is often exposed. That's where Exodus 17 meets us. What unfolds in this chapter is far more than a battle. It's a lesson about dependency on God, which is exactly what God is trying to teach the people of Israel. He wants them to understand they were never meant to rely solely on their own strength, solely on themselves. So let's break it down, starting with verse 8. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Like Joshua, there isn't much detail about Amalek in our passage, but I do want us to know that this was no random encounter either. For generations, the Israelites, they lived as slaves in Egypt. You guys have heard us talking about that over the last several weeks. You know the story. But Scripture tells us that God heard their cries. And so he sends Moses to confront Pharaoh. He sends plagues, and then he parts the Red Sea and eventually delivers them into freedom. And after all of this, Israel, they arrive in the wilderness, and something begins to change. Up to this point, they had mostly been watching God work on their behalf. But now God is putting them in situations where they have to respond and trust them for themselves. You see, God was using the wilderness as a time to teach Israel to trust him. Every single day, they were reminded that they couldn't provide what they needed on their own. If they were gonna make it, they would have to depend on him. But the problem wasn't that God failed to provide. The problem was that Israel struggled to depend on him. We see this again and again. When a need arose, their first response wasn't faith, it was complaining. It was grumbling. We see this in Exodus 15, verse 23 and 24. When they arrived, or when they came to Moriah, they could not drink the water of Moriah because it was bitter. Therefore, it was named Moriah, and the people grumbled against Moses. At this point in the story, the people, they've crossed the Red Sea. They've entered into the wilderness. And before long, they run into a problem. They're thirsty. And after traveling through the desert for days, they finally find water. But when they get there, they discover that it's bitter and they can't even drink it. And if you've ever been in a situation where you're really thirsty, and you stopped at Casey's, and you went to the pop machine, the fountain one, and you got a cherry Pepsi, got it, and then drank it later and realized it's flat, you know how disappointing that is. I was there a few days ago, true story. That's what they're going through. You can imagine that's what they're experiencing. But instead of trusting God, the people begin to complain. And yet in the midst of all of it, all their complaining, all their frustration, God provides. He makes the water drinkable and he gives them what they need. Then in Exodus 16, another problem comes up. This time it's not hunger or thirst, but hunger. Once again, the people begin to question God. And they're questioning, will God take care of us? Is he with us? And once again, God provides. He sends manna from heaven for them to gather each morning. Now, if you look closely at both of these stories, both of these moments, you start to see a pattern emerge. A problem comes up, the people struggle to trust God, and then God provides faithfully. Over and over, God teaches the same lesson. He says, your future doesn't depend on your ability to take care of yourself. It depends on learning to trust me, the God who has promised to take care of you. And then we arrive at Exodus chapter 17, verse 3. But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst. They're thirsty again. For a third time, they begin grumbling. For a third time, they begin questioning Moses. For a third time, they struggle to trust God. You see the pattern? It's almost impossible to miss. No water, God provides. No food, God provides. No water again, guess what? God provides. After all they've witnessed, after all the ways God has provided, it seems like dependence on him should come naturally. It should be obvious. This is not something we should think about. And it's easy for us to look back at these people from thousands of years ago and think, man, these guys didn't get it. How could they miss it? But what if we saw them as a reflection of ourselves? What if we are the Israelites in this story? I mean, think about your own life for a moment. Many of us can look back and point to specific moments where we saw God's faithfulness on display in our lives. We can remember prayers he answered. We can remember seasons where he gave us opportunities we never thought possible. We can look back on difficult chapters of our lives and see how God sustained us, how he provided for us, how he carried us through when everything around us seemed so overwhelming and we couldn't even lift our head up. Yet when new challenges arrive, it doesn't take long for us to allow fear and uncertainty to creep back in. Have you ever experienced that? Maybe it's a difficult conversation or a season of waiting, a struggle that refuses to go away. When we're in those moments, it's easy to become so focused on what's happening right in front of us that we forget how God has already cared for us before. We forget what he's already done for us before. And then we find ourselves in a state of worry, in a state of grumbling and complaining. This is why the story we read this morning, the story of Israel sounds and feels so familiar. The problem wasn't that they had forgotten what God had done. The problem was trusting him with the situation they were facing right then, right in front of them. After all the complaints, all the testing, all the provision, Moses summarizes the issue at the end of verse 7. I want you to hear this. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarreling of the people of Israel and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" All right, just sidebar here. When I read the name Meribah, I get super distracted because I like Aladdin, and it sounds an awful lot like Agrabah. If you know the city of Agrabah and Aladdin, kids, I know it's confusing, it's distracting. That's just me being totally transparent with y'all. And you're welcome now that I've distracted you. Now I'm gonna bring you back in. Verse 7, an important question is what the Israelites are asking. Is the Lord among us or not? This is one of the most important questions in the entire chapter. Why? Because it uncovers what's really driving Israel's complaints. Their thirst was real. Their hunger was real, but it wasn't the deepest issue. What they were really asking is, can we trust God when we don't understand what he is doing? And that question becomes incredibly important because the very next thing that Israel faces is not relief from a problem, but a battle. Verse 8, then Amalek came and fought Israel at Rehidim. Earlier I said that our passage today really doesn't give us any information about Amalek, but Moses does in Deuteronomy chapter 25. He's reminding Israel that Amalek, they didn't attack Israel head on at their strongest point. No, they came from behind and they targeted those who were most vulnerable. They attacked those who were lagging behind, the weary, the weak, the elderly, those who could not keep up with the rest of the nation. Honestly, they attacked in the same way that lions attack their prey. Think about that for a second. Lions don't charge into the middle of a herd looking for the strongest animal. They look for the one that's vulnerable and falling behind. That's what makes Amalek's attack so disturbing. They deliberately went after the people least able to defend themselves. It was a calculated act of cruelty against Israel, a nation who is super weak and who is wrestling with questions about God's provision and his presence in their lives. And this is important to remember about Israel too, is that they're not a trained army marching into battle full of confidence. They're a group of people struggling and who had just entered the wilderness and are thirsty and hungry and unable to recognize God in their midst. That's why Moses' response is so surprising. Rather than leading the charge himself as the leader, he turns to Joshua and gives him a job to do. We see this in verse 9. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." Moses tells Joshua, choose men, go out and fight. This is the change I had mentioned before. You see, back when Pharaoh's army was chasing after God's people and escaped seemed impossible, Moses told the people, the Lord will fight for you and you must watch. Their responsibility in that moment was to stand still and watch God do his thing on their behalf. This time Moses is saying something different. He tells Joshua to choose men and to go and fight Amalek. That's a change from what we've seen before. God isn't telling the people to simply stand and watch anymore. He's calling them to step forward and to do what he's asked them to do. But that doesn't mean they can simply rely on their own strength. Remember what God is teaching them. They must depend on him. And I want us to realize that dependence on God, it doesn't mean sitting back and doing nothing. All throughout Scripture, trusting God is often accompanied by faithful action. God calls his people to obey, to step forward, to serve, to persevere, and yes, sometimes to fight difficult battles. Joshua and the men of Israel, they had responsibilities. They had to pick up their weapons. They had to march into the valley, and they had to engage the enemy. And as they did, God was reminding them that their efforts alone would not determine the outcome of the battle. Back to verse 9, Moses says, "Tomorrow I will stand on the hilltop with God's staff in my hand." Don't miss that tiny little detail about what is in Moses' hand. It's the staff of God. For the Israelites, the staff had become a visible reminder of God's power. They had seen it in Egypt. They had seen it at the Red Sea. The staff alone, by itself, held no power. What it was a symbol and a reminder of God's power and faithfulness in their lives. Verse 11. While Moses held up his hands, Israel prevailed. But whenever he put his hands down, Amalek prevailed. The battle is happening in the valley. Joshua and the men, they're fighting the Amalekites. Naturally, that's where the attention would be, right? That's where the action is. That's where you would expect the outcome of the battle to be determined. But the text continues over and over again to bring our attention back to Moses on the hill. Why? Why does it do that? Because every time the Israelites looked up at the hill, they were reminded that God was still with them. This is important because the more that we remember what God has already done in our lives, the easier it becomes to depend on him. Which reminds me of something that happened at our house recently. A few weeks ago, we found a robin's nest right outside our back door. And after the eggs hatched and the baby birds opened their eyes, they began stretching their necks above the nest, and my kids would see them on the daily. And they would always ask, why do they sit like that? What are they doing? And it was kind of an obvious answer. They're looking for their mom. They know that she's the one bringing the food. They know that she's the one who's taking care of them. When we look at the Israelites down in the valley, we can imagine something similar. Every time they looked towards the hill, they were reminded to keep trusting God, who had been providing for them, taking care of them, listening to all their grumbling and complaining, and still giving them what they needed. The victory won't come from their own ability to fight, but from the same God who brought them out of Egypt, parted the Red Sea, provided manna, and gave them water on multiple occasions. Just like the baby birds, Israel was learning to lift their eyes and depend on God. Then we come to verse 12. Moses' hands grew weary. As the morning gave way to the afternoon, the reality of what Moses was doing began to take its toll on him. The battle continued in the valley, but Moses became tired. Every time his arms dropped, Israel, they began to lose. Now, obviously, Moses, he wanted to keep his arms raised, but he couldn't. He couldn't do that on his own. Can you imagine the weight of that moment, the responsibility that he must have felt, even as he was failing to keep his arms up? But I want us to see this. I want us to realize this because I think it's important. Moses isn't failing because he's rebellious. He isn't failing because he lacks faith. He isn't failing because he's disobedient. He's failing because he's human. And maybe some of us need to hear that this morning. We need to be reminded of that. Sometimes you're tired because you're carrying too much. You simply are just carrying too much. It's not because you're doing something wrong. Weariness doesn't mean that you failed. Strong people get tired. Parents get tired. Caregivers get tired. Volunteers get tired. People who deeply, deeply love God get tired. But what's fascinating is that God, He could have solved Moses' problem instantly. He could have removed the fatigue. He could have sent another miracle. He had done it plenty of times before, but instead, he provides Moses with Aaron and Hur. The answer to Moses' weakness was not another miracle, nor was it this sudden burst of supernatural strength. Instead, God met Moses' need through the presence and support of others. In many ways, this is one of the most unexpected moments in our passage this morning. I mean, no one is surprised that Israel needed God. We've seen that before. Of course they needed him. What's surprising is that Moses needed other people. He needed others. I mean, this is Moses, the leader God chose to confront Pharaoh, the man whom God had already performed many signs, many mighty miracles and wonders. There we go. The man who stood at the Red Sea and watched God part the waters. That was Moses. He had seen all of this, witnessed all of it, been used to perform all of these things, but he still gets to a point where he can no longer continue on his own. And I think this is intentional. I think God wanted, even today, for us to see that, to realize that. I think God was teaching Israel that trusting him and relying on other people go together. One doesn't replace the other. Even the man leading God's people needed others to come alongside him when his strength began to fail. Why? Because God wasn't only teaching dependence on him, he was also teaching dependence on others as well. Verse 12, it continues on, it says this, they took a stone and put it under him. I love that part. Because Moses could not continue on. And he needed Aaron and Hur to put him on solid ground. So I have a question for you. Have you ever needed that? Have you ever needed that? Or when have you needed someone's help like that to support you and to place you back on solid ground? Was it during a season when you felt weary, discouraged, or close to giving up? Was it when you were struggling to see things clearly, struggling to stay hopeful, struggling to keep moving forward? God shows his love and care for us when he brings someone else into our lives to help carry us through a season of weakness. What I find interesting in our passage is that Aaron and Hur, they don't run into the valley and fight Joshua's battle for him. They don't replace Moses' position either. They don't remove the responsibility that God has given him. Instead, they simply provide support. And I think this is an important lesson for us. When someone we care about is hurting, our first instinct is to fix the situation. We want to solve the problem, remove the pain, or make the struggle disappear. But the truth is, many of life's battles cannot be solved that quickly. Grief takes time. Healing takes time. Difficult seasons take time. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer another person is not a solution, but our presence. Aaron and Hur could not end the battle below them. They could not remove the burden that Moses was carrying. They could not make the struggle disappear. What they could do was make sure that he did not carry it alone. That's often what people need the most. Not another speech, not another piece of advice. They simply need someone willing to stay and support them through it. Sometimes faithfulness looks much more ordinary than we expect, than we think. The Bible describes believers as a body, a family, a community of people who belong to each other. So I have a question for you. Do you have someone in your life like that? Do you have a community in your life like that? I think these images from our passage they're intentional. They remind us that following God was never meant to be a solo journey. God created us to live in relationship with him and in relationship with one another. But the problem is that sometimes we think that growing in our faith means we need to be able to handle more and more on our own. But that's not what the Bible teaches. The more we grow, the more we learn to depend on God. And we also learn that we need the people God has put in our lives. The strongest God followers are not those who need nobody else. They are the people who are secure enough to admit they are struggling, humble enough to receive help when they need it, and faithful enough to offer that same help to others. God didn't create us to follow him on our own. He gave us other people to encourage us, to help us, and to remind us to keep trusting him. As we finish, I want you to remember what God was teaching Israel in Exodus 17. The battle wasn't won because Israel was stronger than Amalek. It was won because God was with his people. God was with his people. That's still true for us today. Whatever you're facing, don't try to carry it yourself. Trust the Lord. Bring it to him. Depend on him by remembering what he's already done for you. And don't be afraid to let other people walk alongside you. God often provides the help we need through the people he has placed around us. We need him. And we need each other as well.